In episode 6, we talked about grid auto flow, where let's open this one up here. When you have more items than can fit in the grid, by default, it'll just wrap onto the next line and create you another implicit row. However, you can let's open this one up here. When you have more items than can fit in the grid, by default, it'll just wrap onto the next line and create you another implicit row. However, you can switch grid auto flow to column, meaning that when we run out of room in our grid, it will just add additional implicit columns instead of adding additional rows. Now, I hinted at a third option, which is grid auto flow dense. So we're going to look at how that works right now. So open up dense and dense start. We've got 70 items here, and we'll make a grid of 10 equal items. So we'll say grid template columns, G2C, repeat 10, 1FR. Good. So we've got our 10 items across. Now, I want to make just a bunch of them different sizes so that we're going to end up with some irregularities. And then we're going to select every sixth one and just make a bunch of them different sizes and be able to span. So we'll say item, nth child, every sixth one, we're going to say background, cornflower blue. That's nice. And then we will say grid column, span 6. And okay, here's what's happening. Let's understand why we're getting these gaps and what we can do about fixing them. So the way that the browser lays out your grid is it takes all of the different spots that we have, and we've got 10 across here. And it takes the first item and says, okay, can I fit it? Yeah. Can I fit it? Yeah. Can I fit it? Yeah. And he keeps going. And then it gets to this 6th one. And we know that it's going to take 6 spots in order to fit this into our grid. However, we only have 5 spots left. So what happens? Well, it just breaks onto the next row and it will continue adding that item. The downside is that it doesn't fill in these spots without extra ones that could fit. Like 7, 8, 9, and 10 could easily fit themselves up here. So what we can actually do with that is if we go back to our grid and we say grid auto flow dense, what's going to happen? Give it a save. Ooh, very nice. Is it will then do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it will hit 6 and say I can't fit it. So let's go on to the next line and we can fit it there. Good. Then it gets to 7 and then it goes back to the start and says, hey, is there any spots where I could just sort of wiggle this one in or maybe just fit it in? And it says, yeah, of course, you can fit it in here. And then we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then we hit 12. And at this point, we're where the 13 is. And of course, it's not going to fit. So that will go on to the next line. And then once we hit 13, it's going to go back to the first available grid column or grid row that we have and see if it can fit it in. So it's pretty neat. Let's actually take that off just for a second and go ahead and make some bigger ones here. So we'll say item, nth child, every 8n, we're going to make the background tomato. Delicious. And we will make them span 2. So grid column span 2. Good. And then let's go and do one more selector and do some rows. So say every 9n, we will say grid row span 2. And that will just make a bunch of the random ones. Good. So now we have all of these different spaces available to us. And it would be really nice if they would sort of just fit them in where as possible. So if you do not care about what your order actually looks like in CSS Grid, you can turn this dense back on. and then it will just try and fit all of the different values that you want. Same thing will go as if, like, for example, this 18 here. Let's go to item 18 and give it a background of green, yellow. And oh, that's not going to work because nth child is more specific. So let's do some dirty deeds here. Div. Oh no, not div. How does CSS even work? You know what? Screw it. Beautiful. Okay. So we can move this item to the end. So we say grid column end -1. So it'll anchor it. At the end, again, we're going to need the important there, and that will anchor it over at the end. And CSS will always lay out the ones that need to go in a specific spot first, and then it will say, okay, well, I'm dense, and as I start to auto lay out the rest of the items, I will then look for a spot that I can sort of squeak it into. And in this case, it's actually working out really nicely for us, and there is no extra spots, but it's not the perfect masonry that you might think it will be every now and then. That's just because sometimes you will have holes because there just is not a specific shape for what you have. So we're going to do an example with a photo gallery coming up where I sort of show how you can sort of like load it with lots of these little ones. And in this case, I've loaded it with lots of these little orange or these little yellow ones that are just one spot by one spot, and they can fit really anywhere. And we're going to do that with our photo gallery one as well. So grid auto flow dense is really nice. When you don't have it, you got lots of holes. When you do turn it on, everything fits nicely interchanged. everyone as well. So grid auto flow dense is really nice. When you don't have it, you got lots of holes. When you do turn it on, everything fits nicely interchanged. So even if you're not building a website that is built on this like very strict grid, it might even just be that your grid is 1 column wide and maybe 2 rows high. It's extremely handy to use CSS Grid for centering things. And we all know the jokes about how hard it is to center things in CSS. Well, Flexbox fixed most of that. And I think it's even easier in Grid to center all of your items. So let's actually first take a look at all the different properties. We actually have 6 properties that come along with being able to align things in Grid. We've got justify items and align items. We've got justify content and align content. And then we have align self and justify self. So really the way to understand, I think most people just sort of try one, and if it's the wrong one that they're looking for, they go for the other one. The way to remember it is that the justify ones are along the x-axis or the row axis, and the align items are along the column axis, so top to bottom. And unlike Xbox, they don't switch, so you don't have to like sort of like remember where's my axis going. So let's justify items and align items. We've got justify content and align content, and then we have align self and justify self. So really the way to understand, I think most people just sort of try one, and if it's the wrong one that they're looking for, they go for the other one. The way to remember it is that the justify ones are along the x-axis or the row axis, and the align items are along the column axis, so top to bottom. And unlike Flexbox, they don't switch, so you don't have to like sort of like remember where's my axis going. So let's start off. And what I recommend for doing this is not to come back to this video every single time, but the CSS Tricks article has some really nifty here. These little articles or these little images will show you sort of what each of them do and what all the different properties do. So let's start you off here. I've actually made you a bunch of different items here, and I've given them a class of ITM, not item, just because I don't want the styling that I've given you as base styling in the style.css to play into our understanding of how this works. So first thing we want to do is let's go through the first one, the justify items and align items. So this is the actual items themselves. That's these divs or whatever the direct children are of the container. So let's go into here, and actually let's first put some color on it. So ITM, give it a background of white. Good. So we see how all of our items are, and we'll just go back up to our container and justify items, and let's say center. So what will that do? Ooh, so the default of justify items is stretch, and that will stretch them across the entire actual grid that we have. So here we are. This is the grid. It goes that far. But if we change that to center, you'll see that the actual item itself is only as wide as it needs to be. So if I were to take one of these and add something like Wes is cool, you'll see that that is only as large as it actually needs to be. If it went a little bit longer than that, you would see that it would indeed take up the entire width of the grid. But in our case, since we're just using some numbers here, or Wes is cool, it's only going to go as wide as the actual content is. So we similarly have start, which will bring you to the start. And we have end, which will bring you to the end. You can also interchange those with flex start as well and flex end because those were the values for flexbox, but I think that it makes more sense just to use start and end. We had stretch. Let's see what else we got here. What were the justify items? Start, end, center, and stretch. So those are all the 4 possible options that you have there. So that's along, again, justify is along the x-axis, and then the align items, and that is, let's say, start. See if that does anything different. No, it doesn't, and that's because our rows don't have any height to them. So if we were to go into here and say grid template rows and repeat, I don't know, 5 at 100 px high, you'll see that now our rows are 100 pixels high, and if we were to align them at the start, then they are at the top. Obviously, the end would go to the end, the center will go to the center, and the stretch will stretch them all the way across. So if you did want to perfectly center something, it is as simple as just saying center, center, and that will center exactly inside of that item. So super easy. Even easier, you can use the sort of CSS shorthand that we've got now, which is just called place items, and say center, center, and that will do your justify and your align in a single go. What is it yelling at me about here? Unknown property. Well, we're a cutting edge here, VS Code, and I know about it. So you do want to be careful about browser support for this. What I would recommend doing if you are using place items is to make sure that your auto prefixer will turn your place items into the equivalent justify and align. Let's do a little inspect element, open this up. See, if you open up your place items, you can see that it is just shorthand for these other 2 properties that we have. So again, justify on the x-axis, align on the y-axis. Anytime we're talking about items, we're talking about the actual items themselves. Now let's flip over to the align self and the justify self. So, let's flip over to the justify content and the align content. So we'll go over here. Let's look at what Mr. Coyer has to say about this. Justify content. There we go. So the justify content, if the grid is not as wide as we could possibly want. So there we go. So the justify content, if the grid is not as wide as we could possibly want. So in our case, we're using FR units. And since it's going to go all the way across, but if I were to change this to, let's say 100 px, it actually, maybe it's got to go. Maybe we should just have 5 items. There we go. So now our grid, if we put a border around it, you see our grid is this wide, but I only have 5 columns that are 100 pixels each. So I've got all this extra space. And what do we do with that extra space? That is what justify content and align content answers. So again, justify is on the x-axis. Let's take a look at how that works. So say justify content, and I think start is the default. Yep. Again, we can do end. We can do center. And you see how it's centering itself. And then probably the 2 most helpful one, and these are mirrored in Flexbox, is space around. And what that will do is it will take each of our items. So here, let's bring this back to stretch, so we can visualize a little easier. There we go. And then it will take the extra space and put it in between each of the values that you have. And now you may be wondering, like, why is this not as big as this? And that's because space around will take all of the extra space and evenly divide it on either side of your column. So if you would not like these sort of sideline things here, we just say space between, and that will nix the left and the right, which is almost always what you want when you're trying to perfectly align your values. And then it'll just take the extra space and put it in between each one. So now if if I make this 130 or something like that, there's a little bit less space, but it will still put it evenly in between that. So again, if you have extra space in your grid, meaning that your container is wider than your grid needs to be because you've used a hard pixel value or a rem or for M value, not a FR unit or percentages, then you can use justify content to tell it where those items tend to go. Similarly, if your grid has an actual height on it, so now let's get rid of some of these. Let's just bring it down to 10 items. And let's say that in this case, we don't need all these template rows either. Let's get rid of that. There we go. But if our container had a hard height on it, like 500 px, what's going to happen? And by default, these items are stretching, right? You know how stretch is the default, but we can align content. We can say center, and that will center them. We can say start, and that will put them at the top. End, and then similarly, space around, we'll put them around, and space between, we'll do that. I don't run into that all that often, just because a fixed height on a grid is not as common as a width on a grid, but it's good to know. Again, align is the vertical axis, justify is the horizontal axis. Good. And then finally, we've got these last two, which is align self and justify self. And what that allows us to do is to overwrite each of those on a case-by-case basis rather than a single basis. So let's take item 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take item 5, and this would be on the item itself. And we could just do something like, let's say we wanted to do it along the x-axis. That's justify. So justify self, and we could just say center. Oh, you have to spell it right for it to work. There we go. So you see how all of these are stretch, but I can overwrite it on a case-by-case basis with the ability to justify self. Align self works exactly the same way. If I were to center that, then it's going to pop it down center. And why is that not working? Well, we actually don't have any height on this actual element. But if I did, it would perfectly center itself. So good to put those in your back pocket. I try to think of some sort of silly way to remember that justify is on the X or the row axis, and align is on the Y or the vertical or the column axis. But after a while, you tend to remember it, or just bookmark this little page and look at the items there. So we got a bunch more examples coming up on when we can use that. And myself, I actually use this quite a bit just to center text inside of actual elements. And again, if you look back at the style.css, which is our base style, you'll notice that on each of the items, I have just displayed grid, and I haven't given it any columns or rows or anything. But this little ditty right here, where display grid, justify content center, align items center, that's a great way just to take whatever is in an element. It might just be a paragraph tag, might be raw text, might be a couple paragraph tags, and just to perfectly center it without having to really worry about it. You can also do this with Flexbox, but I actually think I prefer to do it in Grid just because of the ability to both do justify self and align self, whereas with Flexbox, you can only do align self. There is no justify self in Flexbox, which is a bit of a bummer. Maybe it'll come back in a revision to the Flexbox set, but I'm pretty happy with that. All right, let's move on to the next one. We're almost done our fundamentals, and then we're gonna dive into some real world examples. All right, real quick one is the ability to reorder your item. So if there was not enough ways to move where your items go in CSS Grid, there's also an order property, which will allow us to show up where we want them. So let's open up reorder grid and order start. And we got an example coming up where we're going to have a logo and a navigation, and we want to reorder it at immediate query. But let's do a quick little example of what this would look like. So here I'm going to make a quick little grid. So I'll say grid, template, columns, and we'll repeat. Let's do a 10 grid at 1 FR. Good. And then I want the content to be grid column 1, -1, because I want it to go all the way across. Good. And then the logo, I want it to span 2. So grid column, just span 2. And the nav, I want to grid column span 8. Good. I have my logo and I have my nav, but what if I wanted to put the nav before the logo or any other order that I would want? And that sometimes would happen at immediate queries. As soon as you get at a smaller point, and this is an example we're going to have, I want to put the nav above the logo. So how would that work? Well, you can give your items an order property. So if I go to my logo and give it an order of 1, that actually puts it at the end. And why does that happen? Because the default order of everything is 0. And then if you give something a 1, it actually moves it to the end. So we need to put an order property on the rest of our items here. So logo will be 2, nav order will be 1, and then the content order is going to be 3. And there we go, we have it all. What I should mention before we get into any of this, because obviously it's very simple on how it works, is that it will goof up your select as well as your accessibility. So even though the source, before we get into any of this, because obviously it's very simple on how it works, is that it will goof up your select as well as your accessibility. So even though the source order, logo, nav, content, and then it goes nav logo content, so they are coming in different orders, it will both goof up the order at which your screen reader will read it back to you. So don't do this for things that have, in this case, the nav and the logo, it doesn't matter which order they come into a screen reader. But for, let's say you had some content, don't rearrange like a paragraph tag into a different order with CSS, because it's not going to get read back to everyone that way. So, and also if I ever try to select this text, say select nav, and then as soon as I get the logo, it unselects it. But if I were to 1, and then the content order is going to be 3, and there we go, we have it all. What I should mention before we get into any of this, because obviously it's very simple on how it works, is that it will goof up your select as well as your accessibility. So even though the source order, logo, nav, content, and then it goes nav logo content, so they are coming in different orders, it will both goof up the order at which your screen reader will read it back to you. So don't do this for things that have, in this case, the nav and the logo, it doesn't matter which order they come into a screen reader. But for, let's say you had some content, don't rearrange like a paragraph tag into a different order with CSS, because it's not going to get read back to everyone that way. So, and also if I were to try to select this text, say select nav, and then as soon as I get the logo, it unselects it. But if I were to select it like backwards, it still doesn't work. So those are two gotchas with the order property. Make sure that you know how that works. So that's my very simple example as to how order will work, but we'll go into some more advanced examples, or very simple examples as we get into real world. So this one is sort of an album layout example. It's a pretty standard thing to have where you each have these like cards on the screen and you have an image to the left and you have some text to the right. However, there's like a lot of like little delicate stuff that you need to keep in mind here. So this one is going to teach us both about how to nest grid inside of another grid. As well as give us some practice with using auto fit and min max. So, kind of the cool thing about this is that there are no media queries in this entire thing, yet it is completely responsive, meaning that as big as it goes, you have 4, and then as you get smaller, it snaps down to 3, down to 2, and then eventually, once it's too small, it'll snap down to a column of 1. Without having to write any sort of media queries, which I think is pretty neat. So let's go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to open this one up on another tab so we can reference it. Open up the starter file, and what I've done, let's look at some HTML that we've got here. So we have div with a class of albums. That's going to be our grid. And then each album is going to have some artwork, which is just a random image coming off of Unsplash. And then inside of that, we will have our album details, which go to the right of it. So initially, when I tried to do this one, I actually thought I could get away with not having this sort of album details wrapper div and just have like the H2 as a sibling to the image. And while I do find with CSS Grid, you have a lot less wrapper components, you still have to have them. In this case, it was a really good use case of when sometimes you need to wrap a bunch of elements in a wrapper div. So we have our album details of the H2, a paragraph, another paragraph, which is the artist, and then sometimes there's multiple descriptions, and sometimes there's just one description that we have here, and we want to have it vertically centered inside of this card, so regardless of where we're at. So let's kick it off here. First things we're going to do, and by the way, you should pause this and try to do it yourself before we move along. To the right. However, there's like a lot of like little delicate stuff that you need to keep in mind here. So this one is going to teach us both about how to nest grid inside of another grid, as well as give us some practice with using auto fit and min max. So kind of the cool thing about this is that there are no media queries in this entire thing, yet it is completely responsive, meaning that as big as it goes, you have 4, and then as you get smaller, it snaps down to 3, down to 2, and then eventually, once it's too small, it'll snap down to a column of 1 without having to write any sort of media queries, which I think is pretty neat. So let's go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to open this one up on another tab so we can reference it. Open up the starter file, and what I've done, let's look at some HTML that we've got here. So we have div with a class of albums. That's going to be our grid. And then each album is going to have some artwork, which is just a random image coming off of Unsplash. And then inside of that, we will have our album details, which go to the right of it. So initially when I tried to do this one, I actually thought I could get away with not having this sort of album details wrapper div and just have like the H2 as a sibling to the image. And while I do find with CSS Grid, you have a lot less wrapper components, you still have to have them. In this case, it was a really good use case of when sometimes you need to wrap a bunch of elements in a wrapper div. So we have our album details of the H2, a paragraph, another paragraph, which is the artist. And then sometimes there's multiple descriptions, and sometimes there's just one description that we have here. And we want to have it vertically centered inside of this card, so regardless of where we're at. So let's kick it off here. First things we're going to do, and by the way, you should pause this and try to do it yourself before we move along. But other than that, let's get rolling. So I'm going to start off with the actual grid, which is the albums. So albums, we're going to display grid, and how wide should each grid template be? Well, grid template columns. Oop. We're going to repeat, and we're going to use that other one like we did before. We're going to say auto fit, and let's just give it a hard 100 pixels. So however many 100 pixels ones work. Obviously, that's not going to work very well. So what we really need to do here is to change this to be a min-max. At a minimum, I want it to be 400 pixels. And at a maximum, I want it to be 100% wide, which is 1 FR. And then what this will do is the sort of the size of the content side of it, we'll figure out how many can fit on a page. So that's looking pretty good. That's the basis of our grid. Now let's go down to the album and style that a little bit. Just the background. I'm going to put a RGBA on it. Some box shadow. Looking good, looking good. Let's go back up to our grid here and say grid gap, I don't know, 20 px. It's looking pretty good. Our album should have some padding of 20px on it. Now, how do I actually get the image and the text to go side by side? If the albums is the grid and the album is the grid item, how do I use grid on the actual album itself? And this is very similar to Flexbox in that your grid item can also be a grid container at the exact same time. So even though album is itself a grid item, we can display grid right on it. And then we're going to make 2 columns. And if we look at this version here, we're going to make 1 column that is 150 pixels wide. For the image, and then the rest for the description. So we'll say grid template columns, and we're going to have 150 pixels for the first one, and then 1 FR for whatever's left after that. And you see that the values are butting up against each other. We'll have a grid gap, 20px maybe, so it's not bumping up. Maybe I'll bump that down to 10px. Good. Now I want inside of this album here, I want the everything to be vertically centered. So you tell me it's align items. It's going to be center, and that will vertically center. They are being very big. Let's try to debug. I actually don't know why they are being so big. Let's see what is then causing that. Grid template columns. We'll turn on, let's get our dev tools out. We'll go to layout. We'll turn on one of the album and see what we're dealing with here. Something is causing it to be big. What could it be? Not that, not that, not that. Not, oh, you know what? Maybe it is the natural. Is that what it might be? The natural size of the image tag, 300 pixels high. And how high are these things? With 340. Yep. So 300 pixels high plus the 20 pixels of margin on our 20 pixels of grid gap that's causing it. So actually that's really interesting little bug that we ran into there, because the natural image height was 300 pixels. It was actually causing it to be bigger than it actually should be. So how do we fix that? Let's take a look. I'm willing to bet if we select one of our images, which is album artwork. So we'll give ourselves a selector here and give that a width of 100%. So it spans the entire width of its column. Does that fit? There we go. That fixes it. And that, I guess that will kick it into, I'm very curious to see if Chrome does the exact same thing. Let's take a look. There. So that's a little bit more of some more info, because what was happening here is that the column is only 150 pixels wide, but I had not set my images to be 100 pixels wide. So in the case of Firefox, they were automatically resizing it. And in the case of Chrome, it's spilling outside of the column. And that's what's actually computing the actual height of the image. So by adding a width 100%, what it will do is it actually forces the image to size itself, not based on its natural 300 pixel width, but based on the available space for it, which is 150 pixels for the container. And then that will in turn kick the height to resize itself as well, because images are proportional. So a little good thing to know there. And I guess opening it up in another browser would have showed me a little bit quicker. Good. So we've got this. They are vertically centering themselves on there. I'm going to go to my album and say color white and change up the font weight 100. Beauty, looking really good. Now, as we resize it, you should see that we have more on the screen as we have more space, and you can play around with the actual size of this one. You could go down to 300 pixels and fit them. What is really neat about using this grid template columns and fit as many in as long as they are at least 300 pixels is that this layout, this grid that we did here, currently it's bound by the resizing of the browser. But if I had this album grid, maybe two grids side by side, and one of them was like, you should see that we have more on the screen as we have more space, and you can play around with the actual size of this one. You could go down to 300 pixels. and fit them. What is really neat about using this grid template columns and fit as many in as long as they are at least 300 pixels is that this layout, this grid that we did here, currently it's bound by the resizing of the browser. But if I had this album grid, maybe 2 grids side by side, and one of them was like 30% of the browser and the other one was 70% of the browser, they would only show maybe 1 in the first column and then 2 in the actual second column. So I would have 2 grids side by side, and it's almost sort of like element queries or container queries there, where they will just fit as many as they can in the parent container. And in this case, the parent container is as wide as it will actually go. So hopefully you learned a thing or two there about nesting grids. Let's move into the next one, which is building an image gallery.